David Fowley, we've cracked the code.
Hmm.
Throughout the course of this year, we've discussed a number of films that we have not really agreed on. And we've finally broken the spell by going to see a movie in a theater together for the first time in a long time. And I figured it out. It's when we talk about things that we stream at home and then discuss, we just can't seem to agree. But we went out earlier this week to see A Real Pain, the new Jesse Eisenberg film that he wrote and directed. It's got a lot of awards buzz to it, and I understand why. And we are both incredibly high on this movie, and we're going to talk about that today. So first of all, I'm glad we're here in this space of agreement. And also, thank you for recommending this movie and dragging me out of the house because I was skeptical. I was interested, but as I've been on my award season rants in the last couple of weeks, very skeptical. So I'm glad to be proven wrong on this one.
I'm glad too. It's always good to talk about a movie that somebody else likes as much as you. And yeah, I was really looking forward to this. Heard a lot of buzz from Sundance earlier this year, so um, I yeah, I mean, it just seemed like a sure shot.
Yes, it did seem like that, but as I found, there are no sure shots. I go into a lot of movies. I go into every movie hopeful, sometimes skeptical, always hopeful, and it seems more and more I'm let down. I think this film makes up for the last like 6 or 7 movies I've seen. It is so good and so rich. It's really about something, and it's 90 minutes long. Now, we talk about runtimes and stuff like that, but what I'm getting at is this movie feels like it crams more into a slim 90 minutes than other things that are, twice as long or, 2 hours even. I appreciate that. It's unbelievable that Jesse Eisenberg should be this talented because he wrote it, directed it, and stars in the movie, and he knocks all three aspects out of the park with this one.
Yeah, I mean, he's been at it for a while, and I think so. I like him, and early on in this movie, we see him. We're getting to know this character. He plays a guy named David, um, who's lives in New York with his wife and little toddler. um, Early on, we see him kind of like somewhat anxiety ridden, somewhat, I would say, yeah, just a little bit of a high anxiety to him. And I felt like, oh no, because he plays those characters a lot. And he's kind of like how Woody Allen would play the same kind of role in the 80s a lot, in the 70s and 80s. I think Eisenberg sometimes does that. And that there's a lot more there, like going on. And you're like, oh man, I hope he didn't write himself another like easy role but that kind of disappeared after a while because I found a lot more under the surface with this character. And it isn't so much what he says, it's more so what he doesn't say and how he responds to his cousin, who's, I would say, well, very different from him. And they're about the same age, months apart, probably. And that cousin is played by Kieran Culkin. So we have David and Benji, and they meet up at the airport early on in the movie, and they are about to go on a trip to Eastern Europe, specifically Poland, to because their grandmother recently died, probably about 6 months ago, and grandmother had a really good connection with definitely Benji and David, but more so Benji. And grandmother's of Polish descent. They wanted to trace back where she came from and see where she was born, where she lived, and also while they're at it, might as well take a Holocaust tour. So, so it starts off with them in the airport. They travel together. They land. They meet uh, the rest of the tour group, and the movie is pretty much about that what that tour group kind of the interaction between the group and the guide, and also primarily the not brothers, their cousins, um, and how much different the cousins are. Now Benji is a complicated character, much more complicated than David. David's a lot more, I would say, on the narrow path, and has a structure to his life, and is very OCD, and also deals with his own anxiety by keeping it all in and taking meds and running. Whereas Benji has deal with his own grief and anxiety by just, I wouldn't say he doesn't have a filter. He just is very frugal, or very, what's the opposite of frugal? Very free with the truth, his truth, what he sees. And that's not always, it can be somewhat socially disruptive and surprising. But I think he does at the heart of it mean well. It's just, where his perspective and his opinions are placed is sometimes a little jarring and off-putting. But yeah, so David, as this trip goes on, David is experiencing a lot of embarrassing moments because of Benji's truthfulness, let's say, and his outgoing nature. And it's very interesting to see. There's a lot more going on, but I'll stop there so we can talk about this. But
Yeah, and we can talk mild spoilers. I don't want to get like I said, it's a relatively short movie. There's a lot going on, and I think there's a lot for people to discover.
yes,
And I wouldn't want to rob folks of that. What instantly struck out to me is, Kieran Culkin is so good in this role, but it's a completely aggravating role.
yeah,
Because I mean, you say he's speaking truth, he's speaking his truth. Yes, it is definitely his perspective on things, but he doesn't really ever take into consideration anybody else's
no,
feelings or perspectives. He projects his own version of what he thinks their perspectives should be, and then he acts on that. For
yeah,
example, Jennifer Grey plays, was it
Marsha,
Marsha? Yes.
yeah,
First of all, I want to say, and I stand by this, and I mention every time I get a chance, whoever convinced Jennifer Grey that it was a good idea to get that beautiful face messed up by that nose job decades ago, there's a special place in hell. She's
argue.
not to say she's not a great actress and a very, still beautiful woman in her own right, but man, that is such character in that beautiful face.
Yep.
But she is recently going through some, I think, marital problems. She's found herself at a kind of a lonely place in her life, and she's on this tour. And Benji just kind of like gloms onto her. I do like the fact that they don't end up in, this is a spoiler, they don't end up in a romantic relationship, because you see that that's where this would go in any other movie. At least some kind of a one night stand and awkwardness and all that other stuff.
Mhm.
But he kind of like makes assumptions about what she needs, and when she needs it, and kind of gloms on like, oh, she's walking by herself, she must need someone to talk to. No, sometimes people just want to walk by themselves. And he goes on this kind of an anti-rich people capitalism rant when they're on the first class car of this train that very clearly irks people. And the rest of the tour, the other people on the tour are very visibly shaken and annoyed, but they're kind of too polite to really get upset about it. Plus David is there to kind of wrangle Benji and try and fix the situation. But it brings to mind a lot of the other movies that we've seen this year, that's sort of the awkwardness of discomfort and bizarre social interactions that lead to sometimes murderous tragedy, in terms of like Speak No Evil. And sometimes you've got a movie like Heretic, which, I mean, those are both like horror movies. So this is like the socially awkward comedy version of that, where in a number of other circumstances, someone would have said, look, we paid good money for this tour, we don't need this nonsense, so
Right.
please, Mr. Tour Guide, kick him out or give us a refund or something. We want to have this solemn moment, and he's blowing it. But I think that speaks to the strength of the performances, the people on this tour group, I believed that these would be the kind of people that would try and be understanding and empathetic even through their frustrations.
Yeah.
They're not going to lash out, and they feel more like real people.
Yeah, and he's not like, Benji isn't like prone to outbursts necessarily, like a pattern of outbursts. I mean, by and large, most of the time he's very charming, and he's very persuasive. There's a whole scene where they see this war memorial where these giant, granite soldiers from probably World War One were all positioned as like a statue, like an ensemble statue there. And there's steps leading up to these soldiers, and he basically has David hold his camera and say, or his phone, and say, "Hey, take a picture of us. Take a picture of me." And he poses alongside the soldiers as if he's a soldier, and he manages to, in his excitement, which is quite contagious, he manages to get everybody else in the tour involved, and they all pose like they're in a war. One's a medic because he's a pacifist, and one's, another like general or whatever, and they're all positioning. And by the time that they're all positioned, David has everybody's phone, and he's juggling everybody's phone to take a picture. So I think, if it wasn't for moments like those, and there's more than one of those moments, he would be a completely annoying character. But he isn't. He is. He's a charming guy, and he's very, persuasive and kind of actually fun to be around. But at the same time, he is, like I said, very free with his criticisms of whatever, the way of the world or whatever, how he sees things.
Well, I think it's interesting because that scene at the war memorial where he gets everybody to kind of pose with him, that's very early on
Hmm.
in the tour. If that had been placed later in the movie where he was trying to get people to take that picture of them, I don't think they would have,
Yeah,
because
the more
because
you get to know him. Yeah.
right, because a couple of the other key outbursts. There's the thing on the train, which is awkward. There's the scene in the cemetery
Oh
where
yeah.
he calls out James, the tour guide, for being too talkative and too loose, and not loose with his facts, but having too many facts, and basically being a tour guide during this solemn moment where nobody else had given an indication that this was a problem. It was strictly whatever was going on in Benji's head. It would
Mhm.
have been interesting if some of the other characters had sort of mentioned to him, like, man, I just wish this guy would shut up, but I don't want to say anything because he's such a nice
Right.
guy. And then Benji kind of becomes the voice for the group, but he's always the voice for himself.
Right.
And I think it would have been interesting. It would not have been in the spirit of the film, but if we had gone back to some of those hotel rooms of, the elderly couple, or there are a couple other people on this group, but just hear some of their side conversations, be like, you know what? If this were a 2-week thing, I'd want this guy out of here, but we only have 4 more days.
Right.
The kind of the waiting him out kind of strategy when they're kind of giving their hugs as the guys make their kind of departure because they split off to go visit their grandmother's house towards the end of the movie. I feel like part of it was, yeah, it's great. You're wonderful. You're beautiful human beings, but I also never have to see you again. So I'm going to give you an extra big hug.
Yeah. 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 I would give probably a tighter hug to David. Good luck. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, and I think, yeah, there's that cemetery scene is done really well. I mean, as far as placement, where everybody's placed, and what's happening, because you know he has a point. It is a solemn moment, and let's take it in. Maybe not so much info, sure, and trivia and facts, but there is something. It is probably maybe something that other people might think, but not necessarily say. You know,
True, but I mean, and I think this did come up in one of the. It might have been on the train in the train conversation, which is that's what they paid for. They paid to go on a walking tour of these kind of Holocaust related sites and to learn about the history of it. Now there is a moment where James, our beleaguered tour guide, kind of takes that information on board and later thanks Benji for it. And that's a touching scene. But again, it really is all about the delivery. Instead of pulling James aside and saying, "Hey, could we have like maybe 10 minutes of just kind of quiet so we can reflect and whatever?" That would have been one thing, but he just blatantly calls him out in front of everybody and says, "Look, you're just rambling off all these facts and it's so insensitive and we just want to be here in peace." It's all about the delivery. And again, you're right. I don't think he's got a malignant bone in his body. He's just very self-destructive and very hurting. And I think he needs help. That his brother, or sorry, we keep referring to these
They're like
brothers or
brothers.
cousins. They are practically brothers, yes.
Yeah.
But it's something that David can't give him, and it's something that David seems to be the only one who's really reached out and stayed in touch with him, besides the grandmother who passed away 6 months ago.
Mm.
And there was a consequence of that, which I won't get into because it's kind of central to a big turning point in the film, something we find out about Benji. But you can see how that sort of toxicity, whether intentional or not, can drive people away. And it's even getting to the point where now he only has one person left who's willing to put up with him. And even he's kind of all fraught about it.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it is a willingness to put up with them, but it's also there's a certain obligation that David feels because of what's happened within the past year, but also because he's the one who knows this guy the best, or
Yeah.
and even though they're somewhat estranged, this is what honestly this is what this trip, the goal of this trip was to be, is for them to reunite, bond, get some time together, but also check out their roots. And so it is a willingness, but it's also this obligation of like, oh my gosh, I need to, I'm concerned, David's thinking I'm concerned about him, but I'm also like, there's this great scene that Eisenberg, I was going to call him Zuckerberg, but he played that in Social Network. There's this great scene that Eisenberg just masters, where Benji leaves during a dinner because he can't take it anymore, and he goes to the washroom, and then Jesse Eisenberg's at the head of the one end of the table, and he just kind of unloads on everybody, not in a rant necessarily, but just like it's a gradual, almost like a deep emotional sigh, like a gradual release of like
The dam burst. Yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah, here's what
yeah.
I'm going through, here's what I've been dealing with. I love him, I'm embarrassed by him, I hate him, I want to be him. I think that was a key line right there. I want to be him, because it's like you do envy somebody who's as free as this, in a way. There's just like, wow, I wish I could be that free and confident, and just to be so outspoken. And so you walk into a room and everybody looks at you because you're just so engaging and charming, and whereas David probably most of the time doesn't really feel seen, and part of him is probably fine with that. But there's another part of him that's like, you know what? I have thoughts and feelings too, and I would like to be a part of a group.
Well, I mean that I think that also, and I just thought about this as you're mentioning it. The idea of being seen and what David does for a living. He sells internet ads, and Benji kind of makes fun of him for it. And you can see that Eisenberg gets, or yeah, it might as well be Eisenberg, but David gets very defensive about that. And you can just see like he's doing this job to provide for his family and he thinks he's doing, some good. It's a story he's told himself. Like, well, without ads, a lot of websites would go, go under, and it's the lifeblood of the internet and all that stuff. He's obviously built this up in his head, but it's also another thing, like it's not a glamorous job. It's
It
something that he's doing for unglamorous
right.
reasons, but they're also kind of the best reasons. Whereas, yeah, you could be a free spirit and just live on people's couches and have
Mhm.
outbursts whenever you want and do whatever you want. But at the end of the day, I mean, the bookend shots of this movie, the opening and the ending, I think are perfect. But they
Mhm.
also illustrate what Benji really has to offer, and it's not something that David should envy.
True. True. I mean, yeah, in certain settings and circles, sure, you could envy it. But as far as functioning in life, yeah, not so much.
Yeah.
Um, when he describes his job, it reminded me of Billy Crystal describing his job in City Slickers. So I sell airtime, and it's like on a radio, and I sell air, but
Yeah,
uh,
do you remember Christmas Vacation where Clark Griswold describes the cereal additive that he's
right, right,
it's semi-permeable, it's non-osmotic, and
yeah.
yeah.
But
Oh,
I think you know, this is somewhat, I would say, semi-autobiographical for Eisenberg. He wrote this, and he had a lot of. I think he came up with a play at first, and then a short story, and he kind of combined them both to make this. And him and his wife did a similar tour not too long ago. But yeah, it does seem very reflective and personal. But it is interesting to. There's a lot of juxtaposition here too. Is like, okay, yeah, you could sign up for a nice, comfy tour with staying in nice hotels and nice air conditioned bus or whatever, and then you get dropped off at all these memorials, war memorials, cemeteries, and concentration camp. And this was actually the first narrative film to be actually in a concentration camp, to be filmed in a concentration camp.
oh.
Um,
And
yeah.
those scenes are eerie.
Hmm.
They're not filmed to be like haunting, but just like the kind of the little details. And the movie does do a little bit of hand holding with the James character because we see markings on the wall, these kind of blue markings, and I immediately picked up on it. And it was sort of like the cemetery situation where like I was thinking to myself, wow, that's really messed up. But then James comes in and says for the audience who doesn't know why the camera is focusing on these things, oh, this is what that represents. I'm not going to spoil it,
And there's
but
not a lot of that, though, mind you.
there's not there's a couple of moments like that where I'm just like, it is the cemetery scene. We're like, okay, I get it. Let me just be here in this moment. Um, but speaking of James, the actor Will Sharp,
Yeah.
I just want to shout out him, and this is where I'm going to really show my age because the people I'm about to mention are all in other things that I have not seen, things that I probably should have seen if I wanted to be relevant in the culture. But Will Sharp plays James, the tour guide. Kurt Egaiwan is Eloge, who's one of the other tourists, and we've got elderly couple, Liza Sedovoy, and who plays Diane, and Daniel Oreskes playing Mark. And then we've got, of course, Marsha that we mentioned. But they are the caliber of actors that I possibly because I'm not familiar with their other work, I didn't recognize them really. But there was nothing actually about these performances. It felt almost as if Eisenberg had convinced these random people to be in a movie and just said, "Okay, I'm going to come in here with Kieran Culkin. We're going to pretend to be cousins going on this wacky, weird adventure. So just give us your reactions." Because there's such
Hmm.
naturalism, particularly in the case of James, who seems utterly befuddled, utterly wounded, and completely sympathetic to the plight of these two cousins, even if you can tell his frustrations. Like there's a part of him that wants to tell Benji where to shove it, but he also it's not that it feels like he might lose his job or something. He just doesn't want to do something that could, injure another person. He is that kind of heartfelt, sympathetic of a character. And
Yeah.
there's just something magical about discovering actors doing their thing and it appearing like they're not even, acting.
Yeah. Like in that cemetery scene, basically Benji gives him kind of like a abrupt impromptu Yelp review, just like, just like this is this is how I feel about this. Um, and towards the end, I mean, James isn't just this, you know, information overload guy. I mean, he actually has a passion for this, and he's knowledgeable of the history. And I mean, that's how a tour guide who continuously does these kinds of things should be. But I think there is a tendency to, sometimes lose yourself in all this information, right? And so I think later on, and you said, he's reflective and everything. Later on, he does actually. I appreciate how he was like kind of thanking Benji for, like, I always ask for reviews of my tour and nobody really fills them out or gives me anything really constructive, but you did, and it really hit home for him. And I think it was almost probably, you know, I could imagine that after this tour, he's probably going to maybe revamp it a little bit and give some breathing room for tour, the paying public on these tours to just take it in. Benji was complaining about, I don't see any Polish people that we can't interact with anybody, and there's something to be said about that. Um, so I really appreciated that, because I think, again, some of these things that Benji voices, abruptly, usually, is there are a lot of things that are enlightening, and there's a lot of things that we often think but don't say or act on, and that's just not how Benji rolls. He thinks and acts a lot of times without an internal, like, filter, or yeah.
And I think, if I had one criticism of the movie, it would be that I'm thinking back on it. We saw it the other night, and it's somewhat fresh in my head, but I don't have all of the details down. But he doesn't ever really lose, does he? I mean, he's does whatever he wants, whenever he wants. Things happen to both he and David, but they always kind of end up fine. Like when they miss their train stop, and then they're able to instantaneously regroup with the rest of the tour. There are no real consequences for the way that he acts or the way he lives his life or treats people. I think that might be sort of magical screenplay thinking. And it's not that I want to see something bad happen to him. It's just kind of odd, unless he does actually have magical powers.
Well, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I'm glad he doesn't have this real eye-opening moment where he's like, "Wow, I am a dick," because, uh, yeah, I mean, that would be almost like too convenient to wrap something up like that. But
I'm not saying he has to have a moment where that happens.
yeah,
I mean, that could be a moment where David finally says, "Well, look, you finally your charmed life has finally come to a screeching halt, and now I have to get you out of this mess."
mhm,
Even if Benji doesn't acknowledge that, or is like, "Whatever, dude, it'll be okay because David's going to get him out of this mess."
yeah,
That's still his magic working for himself. But yeah, it just did seem a bit. I'm thinking of the other movies that this movie reminds me of, and as much as I appreciate the you know Eisenberg's voice in this genre, it definitely is a genre. And we've talked about some of these movies. I mean, there's the Trip series, which we still have to go back and finish because
yeah,
we started half a Trip, 5, 6 years ago before COVID times. But also, Sideways. There's, to a certain extent, the Holdovers from last year, which is, kind of a generational gap of
yeah.
two people. One's the buttoned up college professor, the troubled student. I'm thinking of, Jesse Eisenberg in The End of the Tour, the David Foster
Mhm.
Wallace movie from James
Let's see.
Ponsoldt from years ago,
Yeah.
which he almost kind of plays the same character here, but a little bit less neurotic. He played a newspaper or an blogger journalist who was following David Foster Wallace, around kind of get his life story.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, it does fit into this odd subgenre, but in those other movies, there typically is some kind of a comeuppance for the freewheeling guy who don't need anybody.
Yeah. And I think the alpha and omega of the movie, visually, the decision to kind of have a similar alpha and omega shot, um, is just kind of bringing us back to, you know, I think Benji is probably at his worst, probably when he's alone. Because at least when he's around either David or when we see him with that tour guide, He can focus on another surrounding, other people, and be less self, introspective. Um, the opening scene finds him, just sitting in an airport, like in a terminal. It's somewhat of a crowded airport and everything, but I think he would almost feel, it seems like it, at home there. And he's, definitely a observant people watcher, but he's the kind of guy who could either totally keep to himself or easily strike up a conversation with anyone. And but left to himself with his just his by him, if he was in a room by himself, I think he would have a hard time with his own thoughts and feelings of like where he's at in life.
I guarantee that. There's something I want to get your interpretation of this,
Mm-hmm.
whether or not he tells a very big lie twice in the movie. Um, when David gets to the airport in the beginning, he's like calling Benji, leaving voice messages saying, "Hey, I'm in a cab, but we're stuck in traffic. I hope you've left for the airport." And meanwhile, Benji's been at the airport for like 4 or 5 hours, just hanging out. The lie is, I think it's more buttoned up in the closing shot than earlier on. But he says, "Oh yeah, the people you meet in the airport, it's crazy. There's so many fascinating people you meet here." But we never see him talking to anybody in the airport. I wonder if that is more of his projection of, like, to your point, when he's not with anybody to be on, that loneliness is deep and profound, and he's not engaging with anybody. I feel like he needs a trigger in order to, you
Mm-hmm.
know, to turn on, yeah, a light switch. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you on that. I mean, I think he believes in what he said about, oh, the people you meet in the airport. I believe that. It's just that I think Eisenberg, as a director, maybe even as a writer, deliberately doesn't show that part because it's
If it even happened.
yeah,
I mean, that's the thing, is I don't know. I feel like he might be trying to keep up his persona of like, "Oh, yeah, I've been here for 5 hours and I made, like, 6 new friends. We had drinks at the bar," or whatever, rather than, "I've been sitting here in this, faux leather seat just staring off into space for 5 hours."
right. Yeah, I mean, it could go either way, but I think he does want to probably keep up with you know uh, this kind of image of how people perceive him. Um, yeah, it's interesting because at the same time, I don't think he really cares about what people think, but I think there's definitely a part of him that somewhat does. Um,
Well, there's something that it's a conspicuous hole in this movie that I don't know, this isn't necessarily a criticism, so I wanna get your thoughts on it. They are cousins, and they had a close relationship with the grandmother, but I don't think they really talk about their parents, like these 2 sets of parents, um, at all.
I think their dads are brothers. I think.
Uh, right, but I'm saying, like, they're separate, I think that's the only reference we get to their
Yeah,
parentage. It's
yeah,
not like, "Oh, yeah, David's family was close and Benji's family was distant, or there's divorce or death or something like that." It's just the 2 of them
yeah,
and then grandma.
yeah.
Um, was there anything else that I missed there, or
I
is that
don't
it?
think so. I mean, there was when it came to talking about family, it was really just the grandmother primarily. They talk about their how their dads are related, but it's all very briefly. But for the most part, it's really just the grandmother. And over time, as the movie unfolds, I mean, you definitely see both of them. The grandmother had, was it Grandma Dory or something like that?
I think so.
Yeah, the both of them had a significant were impacted significantly by Dory, but I think definitely more so Benji because I think she wound up like primarily raising him. Um,
You get that feeling because they were, from what we gather, very similar in terms of temperament, personality, and that scared the hell out of David because he
yeah,
was in fear of the grandmother, whereas Benji, that was his kind of lifeline to the world.
mhm,
And what I'm getting at is there's I am getting this picture in my head of almost an emotional enabling, because when Benji talks about the grandmother, she was like, she had no filter. She didn't take anything from anyone. She said whatever she wanted when she wanted. She lived her life the way that she wanted. And we see that in Benji, but there didn't seem to be a guiding force to tell him, well, yeah, but she's also like 90 years old and lived through, world wars and the Holocaust, and a time when women weren't, it was kind of frowned upon to be that spunky and outspoken. You're just a millennial kid living in someone's basement eating Cheetos and playing video games. um that I'm just It's weird because when you think about the influence, where were the parents to kind of pull him
Yeah.
back, or to say, you can't be like grandma, you've got to interact with people and make your way through life. You have to establish yourself before you can just be the guy who like spouts off the truth, man.
Yeah, there's definitely a backstory there that we're not privy to, and that's okay. We can
Yeah,
definitely.
I'm just saying I noticed it and I wanted to get a read from you if I had missed something, because I like that we don't have all the answers. There's questions there because maybe David doesn't even know the full extent of it, because they weren't brothers, they were cousins, so there is some kind of a gap there.
Yeah, and Benji describes how he, like, every Thursday he would either talk to or see his grandmother, and which is a lot more frequent than David, because, well, David has a job and a wife and a daughter and responsibilities, where as Benji would just take odd jobs here and there, but just basically kind of do his own thing, and be this free spirit. Um, and I think there's it's we get an idea of how David views Benji, and there's definitely moments where they argue, and Benji also kind of throws some criticism back to David about how he's always been kind of tightly wound up and blah blah blah. But
Well, not always, because he does mention in one of the
that's right.
rooftop conversations, like, "Oh, you used to be fun and kind of freewheeling." There was a transition point where he did become more buttoned up, but we as the audience understand that, yeah, that's what happens when you have a wife and a kid, and you've got to, you can't just sit around again smoking pot and playing video games all the time.
Yeah, or you just grow and life
Yeah.
happens. You go to
Mhm.
different stages. When it could be a family member or a friend knows you one way, and then you move on for whatever reason, new relationship, whether it be romantic or not, or a new job or something. That's part of a growth step in your life. And if somebody else is stuck in a place in the past, or not growing, then they're probably thinking, well, what's going on? We used to be close. um, it's understandable, it happens. But then you got to wonder, like, there's a reason why. Well, why is this person stuck in this stage in their life and not moving on or not growing? And it's likely because, like you said, this is somebody who could use some therapy, could need some help moving on. And it's not, I don't think it's just because somebody very important to him has passed on. I think that there's other issues that he could definitely work on. But yeah, it's funny. It's like I had a cousin who was a year younger than me, and watching this movie, I was very much reminded of, like, when we would go on vacation together or something like that, or our families, we would be the ones hanging out and staying up late and roaming around, and he was a lot more bold and adventurous than I was, and a lot more, like, you know charming, and always, for whatever reason, always, like, getting noticed by the girls and the women and stuff. And I'm like, how does this guy do it? It's like, geez, what the heck? And I thought I was, but no, this guy. And so I could very much relate to um especially that line. It's like, man, I wish I would like to be you, but you're also driving me nuts. Um, and I think that there's a good balance, and I think, David is very good for Benji. Um, that as exhausting as Benji can be, like there's that whole scene where they're on the train in Poland, or yeah, going through Poland, and they miss a stop because Benji wanted to let David nap, and he's like snoring and looks so peaceful and blah blah blah. And he's like, "Yeah, we passed our stop, but you were just looking so peaceful. But dude, you had such a nice nap going on." And it's so frustrating because here you are in a foreign country and you missed a stop and you left your tour behind. And it's it's just it's funny to see, but it's just like,
It is funny, but it's also it's fundamentally sad because it's just another manifestation of Benji's self-destructive behavior. Like,
mm,
it's like, yeah, I know we got to get off this stop, but I just want to sit and selfishly watch my cousin sleep because I think it's cute. And the other people were kind of like laughing and making fun of your snoring or whatever. But, who cares? We'll get off at another stop and we'll find our way back. I don't care if that gives my cousin anxiety when he wakes up from his peaceful nap. He's going to be stressed out for the next several hours trying to get us out of this mess.
I honestly think it's not so much he thought it was cute. I honestly think it was his way of saying, you know what, I'm going to give David this time. He needs it. And he's so peaceful. I'm just going to let it happen. And in his mind, he's just thinking, so we get off in the wrong spot, we'll just get back on the other side. But not realizing how this is going to impact David.
And I think that's the point, is like, yeah, you want to give them the gift of a good night's sleep, sure, but or not a good night's sleep, a good afternoon's nap or
Yeah,
whatever, but also the ability to think forward, like any, like playing chess, like two moves ahead.
no.
Like, yeah, he's gonna have a great nap, but then when he wakes up again, he's gonna spend the next 3 hours trying to figure out how we get, back to our tour group because they've got all of our bags. We have nothing, on us except our passports, essentially. They don't even have their money, I don't think, because they have to like sneak onto the train and do that whole maneuver of like walking up and down the rows.
But
Um,
that's how he thinks. He's an of the moment, in the moment thinker. He's not like, he doesn't have those chess moves, and thinking 3 steps ahead.
yeah, and I think, you had mentioned that Eisenberg has played, kind of variations on this level of anxiety before. I've not seen I've seen a handful of his movies, but I've mostly seen the ones where he's kind of got these tics, but he's very much insufferable and snooty. I'm thinking of Mark Zuckerberg and The Social Network. I'm thinking of Lex Luthor.
Yeah.
The closest I think I'd seen him to playing an actual human being was in the end of the tour, and now this. And I really appreciate getting to see that side of Jesse Eisenberg, where that wound upness is not turned into a superiority complex, but an inferiority complex in a lot of ways. And what's great about this is at the end, it's kind of sad because, yeah, Benji's broken, but we also see just how broken and in need of help David is.
Mhm.
But he, as you mentioned, internalizes all of his anxiety, and he's a ticking time bomb, honestly.
He is.
He's doing the right things, but he's not doing the right things for himself. And so, as much as this is sort of a bittersweet movie with the way things end with Benji, it's kind of dark for David.
Yeah, in a way, I could definitely see that. I think at the end, when he does reunite with his wife and daughter, I mean, it's almost like a weight's been lifted, and maybe he can look back and say, I need to reassess a few things, and hopefully, also get the help for him that he needs, to deal with some things. But I think the the trip itself is probably a lot more revelatory for David than Benji. Uh,
Yeah.
and um, yeah, I again, I don't know what it would take for Benji to like actually make some changes in life for him to move on from where he's at. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think he's, both of them are, you know, I think both of them really admire each other. Well, admire aspects of each other in interesting ways. And I really appreciated how, like, even though Benji is a lot in a real pain. I love the title because he is a real pain, but he's also experiencing real pain.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I think Eisenberg's character is definitely aware of that, of both of those things. Um, and how he, like, there's a period where we mentioned on the train where Benji kind of blows up about, to everybody else on the tour about how, we're comfortable and we're in the, first class car, and we're on our way to a concentration camp. Isn't that bizarre? Isn't that weird? I mean, isn't this doesn't feel right? And he leaves the group and he goes into other, cars, more of the like coach cars. And David kind of excuses himself apologetically, and wants to go check up on him. Where, and he could have just said, I need space from him anyway, but, part of it could be I'm concerned about him, and gosh, I don't know what he's going to be doing right now. So
Yeah.
try and corral him. But it's not like Benji was going to go into the coach car and start like leading songs or something. It's like he was really kind of worked up, and I think there's a part of David that's like, despite how annoying he is, I still need to be there for him, and I'm still concerned about him.
I think there's part of that. I think there is a little bit of insurance because, yeah, he might not start leading songs, but he could very well, in that state, like someone could bump his shoulder, like in that narrow passageway, and start something,
Mhm. Yeah,
where he's probably like, I've got to go make sure that he doesn't, get everybody kicked off the train or get into a fight. Um, it's weird to me that, I feel like I want to go back and check in on David in a few months to see how he's doing, but I can't do that because he's a fictional character in a movie I just watched. But I am that invested in this.
yeah,
And folks who've made it this far through the episode, I just want to underscore this is a dramedy. This is not a very heavy, depressing, travelogue movie. This is a comedy and a drama, and it's very funny. The uh, first world problems or privilege bit on the train has a wonderful button to it.
mhm,
It's very much a scriptly, writerly thing where it's like, I see that punchline. You were building all this up to this, nice little
right.
moment before you jump to the next storyline, but it works. It's a nice release valve on a pretty tense couple of scenes.
Yeah, I mean, much of the juxtaposition is more so funny than it is, sad or poignant. But also, I think this movie does balance uh, funny, sad, poignant really well. Um, and also, I would say, as Eisenberg, the director, I think visually, what I appreciated too is that I feel like David as a character, when we watch him on this tour, he's very observant, and I think he almost has like this artistic eye where he's like taking pictures of things that maybe nobody else is seeing. And I think as a filmmaker, Eisenberg and his cinematographer is also kind of clued into that, because we're seeing like um, the camera kind of moves on to like maybe a certain image of framed trees, or a framed um, apartment buildings, or old, Polish, village, just a kind of like a landscape. And it's kind of like stopping to, it's not so much as a transition, but stopping to like breathe in the surroundings, and be in the moment and be observant, as observant as David is. So I think, visually as a filmmaker, I think that this is his sophomore effort, and I think this is a huge, step in the right direction. I don't know if you saw his previous movie. Um, what was it? I forget the name of it. It was with Julianne Moore and Let me see here. Gosh, let me pull it up. But that was from about 2-3 years ago.
Hmm.
When you finish saving the world with Julianne Moore, that was also released and debuted in Sundance with Finn Wolfhard.
I don't think I saw that. No.
It was good. I think it's on Prime right now. But that's also about relationships too, family relationships. So, yeah, I mean, it's also interesting too. I almost kind of wanted to know more about the tour because I was wondering if like it was a exclusively Jewish tour.
I think I don't know if it was exclusively Jewish. I don't think it was like restricted or anything.
Mm,
Because I mean, as James, the tour guide mentioned, he is not Jewish, but he is, he has
right,
an appreciation for the culture.
right,
And Eloge was a Jewish convert.
from Rwanda.
I think, yeah, from Rwanda, and that perspective of that, surviving that genocide added a whole new dimension to the movie.
Yeah,
Again, with a nice little monologue of setup with the characters getting to know each other, but then letting the film do the rest of the work rather than having another series of like going through the concentration camp and him saying, "Oh, this reminds me of dot 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 dot."
right.
Now we get that just by watching how he is observing, the different rooms and the horrors that he saw, that
Yeah,
happened there.
or even some of the conversations about that they have going from say point C to D. Um, Eisenberg, the filmmaker, is careful and deliberately um, making an effort to catch those conversations where the tour guide James isn't even talking. It's the conversations that the tour guide the tourists are having, and I really appreciated those because you know that's the real stuff right there. That's like what we're talking about life. We're talking about real stuff and not just like, oh, let's look at this plaque, let's look at this statue, you know and I think
Well,
that
I do want to just circle back to one thing because you mentioned about James, and I want to get back to that cemetery scene
Mhm,
because this is why I think Will Sharp is. Uh, I have not seen a lot of the movies that are going to be nominated for things this year yet. I have not a lot of interest in it, but if it's possible to get him some kind of a supporting actor nomination, it's a very long shot, but I think he deserves it. The scene where again Benji goes off on him,
mhm,
Eisenberg settles on James's reaction, and it
mhm,
is that moment of again, it feels like Eisenberg had directed Kieran Culkin to go off on Will Sharp's character, but didn't tell Will Sharp that was going to
mhm.
happen because the look of embarrassment, of frustration, of what you were saying, he's kind of eyes are darting around to the other people, almost as if he's thinking, "My God, does everybody hate me?
Yeah,
I-
yeah,
Is he voicing like
yeah.
have the last 4 days of people just been putting up with
Did,
me and they all
yeah.
they hate this tour and what
Did
does
they
that
all
mean?"
talk about this and decided that he was going to be the mouthpiece? Yeah.
Right. And he absorbs that. He doesn't lash back out or have some kind of a big frustrated, a counter monologue. And then that button at the end where he has that moment with Benji and talks about, taking that criticism on board.
Yeah.
You can see the wheels spinning of the scenes that we don't see of him taking that stuff in and dealing with his own, embarrassment, possibly anger at that Benji is turning his perfect tour into something that is, kind of chaotic, but
Mhm.
then also coming around and saying, he has a point and like maybe there's some great things I can do with this
Yeah.
tour. One idea I have again for the fictional tour guide of this movie is, maybe the different stops on the tour. He has a dinner at a local restaurant, invites some locals to come and
Yeah.
talk about their experience of living there, that kind of a thing.
Or
But I
go,
can see those happening. Yeah.
yeah, or stop through a marketplace where you're going to have to engage with other people. Yeah, and I think once Benji and David break free of they leave early from the tour group to pursue visiting his grandmother's home. There's a lot. That's where we see, the interactions with local, Polish residents. Actually, quite funny when they visit the grandmother's house. But yeah, and I almost feel like, I don't know if I guess I'm just realizing this now, is like when they do break free, I feel like David becomes a little bit more relaxed and maybe comfortable around Benji, just because Benji doesn't have that audience of the other tourists, and he's not going to be embarrassed by, what Benji says. Like just that scene where they're walking around and crossing the bridge, and Benji's wearing that kind of crazy what do you call him, the Ricola hat.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're just like kind of like walking around and making grand gestures and stuff, and David feels a lot more comfortable in his own skin around Benji when it's just the two of them.
Well, I think, I would say I think you're onto something there, because that leaving the tour, he doesn't have to take care of him in the sense that he doesn't have to worry about what these other people think. He doesn't have to worry about, are they going to get kicked off the tour, get in some kind of trouble, or get into a fight with someone else on the tour because of Benji's actions. So even though he still has to deal with him in Poland and then get him back to
Sure.
New York, there is still that like, and we
Yeah.
can collectively feel that. I also love, and I don't want to spoil it, but you're building up to this big moment of going to the grandmother's house. And so we've seen kind of movies like this, some of the ones that I've mentioned, where there's this big cathartic moment that people are, getting to, but it's not a big moment. It's a very personal moment. It felt very real to the situation of like, yeah, well, this is probably what this would be like now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I
And
can see this actually happening. I mean, it almost feels like that scene, and maybe a couple others, feels almost like documentary filmmaking.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we are about a half hour away from achieving the running time of Real Pain. So I am going to thank you very much, David, again, for recommending this movie, which was a big hit with us. And also, not to tell tales out of school, but there was a very small audience in our theater in Skokie. And uh, two of those people were Daniel Warren Johnson and his wife.
Yeah, his
Yeah.
wife.
Yeah. And we talked to them in the parking lot. Daniel Warren Johnson is a comic book creator, writing two of my favorite series right now: Transformers, the franchise about the robots transforming into vehicles, which is excellent, by the way. And also, The Moon is Following Us, which is a very different kind of very personal comic book, sci-fi genre. So
And I
definitely both worth
and I
picking up.
recommend Do a Power Bomb too. That was a
I
he's
got
collected in trade now too.
I've seen that. I gotta pick that up. But yeah, so catching up with them after the movie, they were also big fans. So that's 4 endorsements.
There you go.
Yeah.
No,
We're
I mean,
definitely
I feel like as far as endorsements, I don't know if this movie really needs our endorsements. I think it needs more. It needs more people need to know about it. But I think a lot of critics are already just kind of praising it, and I feel like this is definitely Culkin is definitely going to get a Best Supporting Actor nomination. Will Sharp would be nice too. Who knows? But I think, and Eisenberg will likely get. I think this could be Best Picture nominee.
I mean, if the holdovers can get up to
Yeah,
those heights, I think this movie can.
yeah,
And I think
yeah,
this is a stronger movie than the holdovers. And I really like the holdovers.
yeah,
But I mean, just as far as endorsements, yeah. But I think what I want folks to take away from this is, don't wait for this to come to streaming.
yeah,
As much as this is a movie about two people kind of walking around and having conversations between themselves and some other people, it really is gorgeously shot.
yes,
You get all the announcements beforehand, like, oh, filmed in conjunction with Polish tourism and all this other stuff. It really is like a guided tour of Poland through some
yeah,
pretty dark places, but it is a big screen experience. Forget Red One or Heretic or any of this other stuff. This will reward you for going out to the theater instead of waiting to see it at home.
yeah. And I also, based on our experience, another reason to see it on the big screen is having to see it with other people. and
Yeah.
it's one of those movies that is open for great discussion afterwards, you know, and it reminded me, I'm like, you know what, yeah, it's nice to this, especially this time of year for critics. I mean, we have access to so much right now on our laptop, on our phone, or whatever at home, and it's still nice to get out and see something with other people.
Yeah, definitely. I should mention we paid for this. This was not critics access, so we paid our hard-earned money to watch it, and you should too out there if you're looking for a reason to leave the house. So, David Fowley of Keeping It Real, thanks again, for the recommendation, for just hanging out. We got to do this more,
Yeah.
and thanks for talking about this movie. We are entering 2025 soon, and I think this is a great indicator of some fantastic, in agreement conversations to come. At least that's my hope.
Yes.
All right, man. Take care.
All right. Take care. See ya.